The scent of lilies and old polish filled the church, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe. Elara, sat in the front pew, a solitary figure in a sea of dark suits and somber dresses. The heavy silence was punctuated only by the rustle of hymnals and the occasional, theatrical sniffle from my Aunt Beatrice, seated 2 rows behind me. Every sound felt like an accusation. The mahogany casket gleamed under the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, a silent testament to the man who had been my entire world, and the reason I was now an outcast in my own family. My father, Captain Alistair, was gone, and in the eyes of everyone here, I was the daughter who had broken his heart. The whispers had started the moment I'd arrived, slithering through the pews like cold drafts. "Look at her," a cousin muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Not a tear. Just like him, all stone. Another voice, sharp and laced with venom, replied, "Stone. She's the shame that weighed him down. He never said it, but we all knew." That was Beatrice. Her voice was as familiar to me as the scent of rain on dry earth, but it had long lost its warmth, curdling into something sharp and judgmental. I kept my back straight, my gaze fixed on the ornate crucifix above the altar. My uniform felt stiff and unfamiliar in this setting, the crisp fabric a stark contrast to the soft, forgiving lines of the mourning clothes around me. It was the source of their scorn, this uniform. To them, it was a symbol of my rebellion, my rejection of the life they believed was my birthright. They had wanted me to be a lady, to marry well, to produce heirs to the family name. Instead, I had followed my father into the one world he had desperately tried to shield me from. The organ began a low, mournful prelude, and the service commenced. The priest spoke of my father's service, his dedication, his unwavering sense of duty. He used words like honor, legacy, and patriot. With every word, I felt the weight of my family's collective gaze pressing down on me. They believed I had tarnished that legacy. They couldn't comprehend why a daughter of our standing would choose the grit and grime of military life, the danger and the sacrifice. They saw it not as service, but as a deliberate act of defiance against a man who had given me everything. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the late-night phone calls, the carefully worded letters, the silent understanding that had passed between my father and me in the years after I enlisted. They didn't know that the chasm they perceived between us was a carefully constructed facade, a necessary fiction we both maintained to protect me, to protect the family from truths they weren't equipped to handle. My father had been a man of quiet complexities, his love often expressed through discipline and expectation. When I was a child, he'd taught me to shoot, not with a toy gun, but with his service pistol, his large, calloused hands guiding my small ones. "Respect the weapon, Elara," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "It's a tool, not a toy. It can protect and it can destroy. The choice is in the hands of the one who wields it." He taught me strategy using a chessboard, celestial navigation using the stars in our backyard. He filled my head not with fairy tales, but with stories of resilience, of historical figures who chose duty over comfort. He was preparing me, I realized later, not for the life my mother and aunts envisioned, but for a life of purpose. When I announced my decision to enlist, the family exploded. My mother wept for days. Aunt Beatrice had cornered me in the study, her face a mask of indignation. "Have you lost your mind? This is what men do, not a girl of your breeding. Your father has built a name for this family. You will drag it through the mud." I had looked to my father for support, but he had remained silent, his expression unreadable. His silence was the most painful cut of all. It was interpreted by everyone as disappointment, as shame. I left for basic training with a fractured heart, believing I had truly lost him. The first few years were a lonely, arduous journey. The physical and mental demands were immense, but the ache of my father's perceived rejection was a heavier burden. Yet I persevered. I found a new family in my unit, a bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. I excelled, pouring all my grief and anger into becoming the best soldier I could be. I wanted to prove to him, even from a distance, that I was worthy, that his lessons had not been in vain. The letters home were stilted at first. I wrote about the weather, the food, the mundane aspects of life on base. He wrote back, his letters equally formal, filled with news from home, advice on managing my finances. But slowly, a subtle shift occurred. He started asking questions about my training, about the equipment, about leadership challenges. I wail. "The answer, and he would reply with anecdotes from his own time in service, offering cryptic advice that was surprisingly insightful. It became our secret language, a conversation hidden between the lines of seemingly innocuous correspondence. We never spoke of the family's disapproval. We never spoke of the pain that first day had caused. We simply built a new bridge, one forged from shared experience and a deep, unspoken understanding. He saw me not just as his daughter, but as a fellow soldier. And in that, I found a different kind of love, a respect that meant more to me than any public display of affection ever could. Now, sitting in this suffocating church, I was that heartbroken girl again, the one who had left home under a cloud of shame. The priest finished his homily and invited family members to share their memories. My cousin, Marcus, a man whose greatest battle was navigating corporate mergers, strode to the lectern. He spoke of my father's business acumen, his love for golf, the family vacations. It was a portrait of a man I barely recognized, a sanitized version stripped of all his grit and complexity. He glanced at me once, a flicker of pity and disdain in his eyes before continuing his bland, polished eulogy. Then, Aunt Beatrice walked up, her black dress rustling with self-importance. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a picture of perfect, dignified grief. Alistair was the rock of this family, she began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. A man of principle, of tradition, he believed in legacy, in honor. Her eyes found mine, and they were as cold and hard as chips of flint. He endured so much in his life, and he bore his burdens with quiet strength, even his greatest disappointments. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A wave of murmurs rippled through the congregation. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment solidifying. I clenched my fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. I would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I would sit here, straight and silent, and I would honor my father in the only way I knew how, with the discipline he had taught me. Beatrice continued, her voice rising with a crescendo of passive-aggressive sorrow, painting a picture of a daughter who had selfishly defied her father's wishes, a source of constant, unspoken pain in his final years. He was too proud to ever speak of it, she lamented, but we, his family, we saw his silent suffering. We knew the shame he carried. Shame. The word was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. It was the final, cruel twist of the knife. I had faced enemy fire, I had endured hardships that would make these people crumble, but in this moment, under the weight of their condescending pity, I felt a vulnerability I hadn't experienced in years. I closed my eyes, picturing my father's face, not the stern, disappointed man they described, but the one who had sent me a worn copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War with a single, underlined passage. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. I had to endure this, for him. The silence that followed Beatrice's performance was heavy, almost suffocating. It was a silence of consensus, of shared belief in the narrative she had so expertly woven. I felt utterly alone, an island in a sea of condemnation. The priest, looking uncomfortable, was about to step forward to conclude the eulogies when a new sound broke the stillness. It was the sound of a chair scraping against the stone floor in the back of the church. A man was standing up. He was tall and lean, his posture ramrod straight even in a civilian suit. His hair was silver at the temples, and his face was etched with lines that spoke of authority and experience. I didn't recognize him. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, walking down the central aisle toward the lectern. A ripple of confusion went through the pews. Who was this stranger? He wasn't one of the family's business associates or social acquaintances. There was an aura about him, an unmistakable air of command that silenced the whispers and drew every eye in the room. He reached the front of the church and gave a slight, respectful nod toward the casket, then turned to face the congregation. His eyes, a clear, piercing blue, scanned the crowd before settling on me. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding that sent a jolt through me. "My name is Colonel Matthews," he said, his voice calm and clear, yet it carried an inherent authority that commanded absolute attention. I did not know Captain Alistair in the boardroom or on the golf course. I knew him as a fellow officer. I was his commanding officer for a time many years ago and his friend for all the years that followed. He paused, letting his words settle. Aunt Beatrice shifted in her seat, a faint frown creasing her brow. This was not part of her carefully orchestrated ceremony. "We heard Alistair described today as a man of tradition, of legacy," the colonel continued, his gaze sweeping over the front pews. "And that he was. But the tradition he valued most was not one of social standing or wealth. It was the tradition of selfless service. The legacy he cared about was not one of inheritance, but of courage." His eyes met mine again, and this time the message was clear. He was here for a reason. He knew. "Alistair and I spoke often," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, drawing the listeners in. "Especially in recent years. We spoke about the world, about our country, about the nature of duty, and we spoke about his children." He looked directly at Beatrice. He spoke of his pride in his son's accomplishments in the world of business. But the conversations that held the most weight, the ones where his voice filled with a different kind of emotion, were the ones about his daughter. A collective, soft gasp seemed to be sucked from the air in the church. Aunt Beatrice's face, which had been a mask of pious sorrow, was now frozen in a state of utter shock, her mouth slightly agape. Marcus, next to her, looked confused, as if the colonel were speaking a foreign language. The entire room was wrapped, caught in the grip of this unexpected turn. The colonel's presence had completely altered the atmosphere. The thick, cloying judgment had evaporated, replaced by a tense, vibrating curiosity. He had taken control of the narrative without raising his voice, his quiet authority more potent than all of Beatrice's histrionics. "You see," Colonel Matthews continued, his gaze unwavering, "Alistair understood something that many people, even those closest to him, might fail to grasp. He understood that courage isn't confined to a single gender or a prescribed path in life. He knew that honor is earned, not inherited. It is forged in the crucible of adversity, in moments where character is tested to its absolute limit." He took a small step closer to the lectern, his hands resting lightly on its edges. The gesture was relaxed, but his eyes were intense. "I am here today not just to honor the memory of a great man and a friend, but to correct a profound misunderstanding. I am here to speak the truth that Alistair, in his own quiet, humble way, felt was not his to share. He believed that valor speaks for itself." The silence in the church was now absolute. It was no longer the oppressive silence of judgment, but the electric silence of anticipation. Every person in that room, from the closest family member to the most distant acquaintance, was leaning forward, hanging on his every word. I felt as though I was outside my own body, watching this scene unfold. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I had spent years building walls around the part of my life that I shared with my father, a secret garden that no one else was allowed to enter. Now, this stranger was about to throw the gates wide open. I didn't know whether to feel terror or relief. "Several years ago," the colonel began, his voice taking on the cadence of a man recounting a critical mission report, "I was leading a special operations unit on a reconnaissance mission in a hostile, mountainous region. We were deep in enemy territory, tasked with gathering intelligence on a high-value target. Our intel was solid, the plan was sound, but as is often the case in our line of work, the situation on the ground proved to be far more volatile than anticipated." Paused, and for a moment I saw the memory flash in his eyes, the dust, the fear, the chilling clarity of imminent danger. I knew the story he was about to tell. I could feel the phantom weight of my gear, taste the grit of sand in my mouth, hear the ringing in my ears. I had never spoken of it to anyone, not even my father, in full detail. It was a memory locked away, a burden I carried alone. "We were ambushed," he said, the words stark and unadorned. "A coordinated attack from multiple positions. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and our primary communication lines were severed almost immediately. We were pinned down in a narrow ravine, taking heavy fire. The situation was dire. We were isolated, with no immediate prospect of extraction or reinforcement. In those moments, you don't think about legacy or tradition. You think about the men and women to your left and right. You think about holding the line." His eyes found me again, and he held my gaze. It wasn't a look of pity, but of profound respect. "Our unit had a young soldier with us, a specialist, quiet, observant, and consistently underestimated by some of the more seasoned veterans because they mistook her composure for uncertainty. But in the midst of that chaos, when panic was beginning to set in, this soldier remained impossibly calm." I felt my breath catch in my throat. The faces in the pews were turning from the colonel to me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. Ning comprehension. Aunt Beatrice looked as if she had been slapped. Her carefully constructed image of me as a willful, disgraceful child was beginning to crumble right before her eyes, and the foundation of her self-righteousness was cracking. While the rest of us were focused on returning fire, trying to suppress the enemy enough to find a defensible position, this young soldier was doing something else. The colonel's voice was steady, each word landing with the weight of truth. She was observing. She was analyzing the pattern of the attack, the angles of fire, the terrain. She identified a critical weakness in the enemy's position, a blind spot on a high ridge that they were using for cover, but which also exposed their flank to a narrow, almost impassable goat trail. He painted the scene with such clarity that I could almost hear the whistle of bullets, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the canyon walls. I remembered the sheer terror of that moment, the feeling of the world narrowing down to a single point of focus. It wasn't a lack of fear that had driven me. It was the fear itself, sharpened into a fine analytical edge by years of my father's training. The chess games, the star charts, the lessons on strategy, they all converged in that single, desperate moment. Without a direct order, he continued, because there was no one left to give one, she took the initiative. She laid down covering fire for two of her comrades, allowing them to shift to a more protected position. And then she did the unthinkable. She broke from our position and began to climb. The colonel's words hung in the air, creating a silence so profound I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. He wasn't just telling a story, he was bearing witness. He was giving voice to the silent screams and unspoken bravery of a day I had tried to forget. She scaled that rock face alone, with enemy fire impacting just feet from her position. It was an act of almost suicidal courage, but it wasn't reckless. It was calculated. It was precise. It was the single, decisive action that turned the tide of the engagement. He let the impact of that statement sink in. He scanned the faces of my family, one by one, letting them absorb the reality of the world I inhabited, a world so far removed from their comfortable lives that it might as well have been on another planet. Marcus was staring at me, his jaw slack. My other cousins, the ones who had whispered and smirked, now looked down at their hands, unable to meet my eyes. The narrative they had held onto for so long, the one that cast me as the family's black sheep, was being systematically dismantled by a man whose credibility was beyond question. She reached the vantage point, Colonel Matthews went on, his voice filled with a quiet awe. And from there, she was able to disrupt their command structure. She neutralized their primary machine gun nest, which had us pinned down, and relayed their positions back to the rest of the unit. Her actions created a window of opportunity, a moment of chaos in the enemy ranks. It was the opening we needed. We were able to regroup, to push back, and to eventually fight our way to an extraction point. Every single member of my unit made it out of that ravine alive. Every single one. He turned his body slightly, facing me more directly now, as if we were the only two people in the room. That quiet, underestimated soldier was Specialist Elara. My name, spoken aloud in this context, felt like a lightning strike. It severed the last thread of their delusion. It was no longer a story about an anonymous hero. It was about me, the girl they called a shame, the daughter who had supposedly broken her father's heart. The collective shock in the room was a palpable force, a wave of displaced air. Aunt Beatrice's face was a mottled canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. She wasn't just learning that she was wrong about me. She was realizing, in front of everyone whose opinion she valued, that her judgment, her entire worldview, was built on a foundation of ignorance and prejudice. I recommended her for the Silver Star, the colonel stated, his voice ringing with authority. The third highest military combat decoration. It was awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. She accepted the medal in a small, private ceremony and asked that it not be publicized. She said she was just doing her job. She said the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home from other missions. He looked back at the congregation. That is the nature of true honor. It doesn't seek recognition. It doesn't boast. It simply is. The silence that followed was different now. It was filled with a dawning, uncomfortable respect. The judgment had been replaced by awe, and for some, by a creeping, sickening sense of their own pettiness. The colonel then addressed the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle. After the official debriefings, I made a personal call. I called her father. I felt he had a right to know what his daughter had done, the kind of woman she had become. I broke protocol to do it, but I felt it was a call I had to make. He paused, his expression softening. I told Alistair everything I just told you. I described her courage, her intelligence under fire, her profound humility. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought perhaps he was as shocked as some of you appear to be now. But then he spoke. The colonel's voice dropped to a near whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. He said, "Thank you for calling, Colonel, but you're not telling me anything I didn't already know. I knew who she was the day I taught her to hold a rifle. I was just waiting for the rest of the world to find out." A choked sob escaped my lips, a sound I couldn't contain. The tears I had refused to shed for their scorn now flowed freely for his pride. That was the secret he had carried. His silence wasn't shame. It was anticipation. It was the quiet, confident faith of a father who knew, with absolute certainty, the strength of the daughter he had raised. He hadn't been disappointed in me. He had been protecting me from their small-mindedness, letting me forge my own path, knowing that my actions would one day speak louder than their gossip ever could. The colonel concluded his eulogy. "The man you are mourning today was not ashamed. He was prouder than any father I have ever known. His greatest legacy is not in his name or his business, but in the character of the daughter who stands as a testament to his true values. She is not the family's shame. She is and always was his greatest honor." With a final, solemn nod toward the casket, and another to me, Colonel Matthews stepped away from the lectern and walked back down the aisle, his duty done. He didn't wait for thanks or acknowledgments. Like a true soldier, he had completed his mission and was now fading back into the background. His departure left a vacuum, a profound and echoing silence filled with the wreckage of years of misunderstanding. Every eye in that church was now on me, but the gaze was different. The scorn, the pity, the judgment, it was all gone. In its place was a mixture of awe, guilt, and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. Aunt Beatrice looked physically ill, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She had built her identity on being the keeper of the family's honor, the arbiter of its traditions. In the space of 5 minutes, her entire world had been turned upside down, her authority exposed as hollow prejudice. She couldn't meet my gaze. None of them could. The priest, visibly moved, hastily concluded the service. The organ music swelled, signaling the end, but no one moved. They remained frozen in their pews, trapped in the emotional aftermath of the colonel's revelation. The pallbearers, including my cousin Marcus, moved to the front. As they prepared to escort the casket, Marcus stopped and looked at me. His face was a mess of conflicting emotions, shame, regret, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen since we were children, genuine admiration. "Elara," he began, his voice hoarse. I had no idea. I'm so sorry." I simply nodded, unable to form words. My throat was tight with a grief that was now twofold. For the father I had lost, and for the years of lost understanding, the chasm that had been needlessly carved between us by the very people who claimed to love him most. As the congregation slowly, awkwardly began to file out of the church, a new kind of isolation enveloped me. Before, I had been the outcast. Now I was an object of veneration and guilt, a figure they didn't know how to approach. The whispers started again, but their tone had changed. "Did you hear that? A silver star. My God, we treated her so terribly. Beatrice looks like she's seen a ghost." Aunt Beatrice was, indeed, a specter of her former self. She remained rooted to her seat, her husband hovering beside her, unsure of what to do. As I stood to follow my father's casket, our paths intersected. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for what? Forgiveness, absolution. "Elara," she stammered, her voice a shadow of its usual commanding tone. We never knew. He never said a word." "No," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "He didn't have to. He trusted me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the truth she had refused to see. I didn't say them with malice, but with a profound sense of sorrow. Sorrow for her, for the love she had twisted into judgment, and for the relationship she could have had with her brother, and with me, if she had only chosen understanding over assumption. I walked past her, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her own making. The reception was held at the family estate, a sprawling house that had always felt more like a museum than a home. I had Drea. Dead it, anticipating hours of feigned sympathy and veiled insults. Now the atmosphere was entirely different. People who had avoided my gaze in the church now sought me out, their hands outstretched, their faces etched with apologetic smiles. They offered condolences that now felt sincere, but it was too little too late. They praised my bravery and my service, using the same words the colonel had, but from their lips the words felt hollow, like polished stones. They were mourning the man they thought they knew and scrambling to understand the woman they had so thoroughly misjudged. I found a quiet corner on the veranda, overlooking the gardens my father had loved. The formal, structured rose bushes reminded me of him, beautiful but with thorns you learn to respect. Marcus found me there, a drink in his hand that he wasn't drinking. "I feel like a complete fool," he said, staring out at the manicured lawn. "All these years we gave you hell. We thought you were throwing your life away to spite him." "I was never trying to spite him," I said quietly. "I was trying to be like him." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a regret that seemed genuine. "I see that now. He was always so reserved, so hard to read. We all just assumed. Beatrice led the charge and we all fell in line." "It was easier to believe I was the problem," I finished for him. He nodded, a grim acknowledgement. "She's devastated, not just because she was wrong, but because she was publicly wrong. The Colonel, he dismantled her entire world in front of everyone." I felt a pang of something, not pity, but a weary sadness. Her world was built on a lie she told herself. It was bound to fall apart eventually. We stood in silence for a long time, the distant murmur of the reception a backdrop to our own quiet reckoning. The family was broken, not by my father's death, but by the revelation of a truth they had actively suppressed. The shame they had tried to heap upon me had boomeranged back, settling squarely on their own shoulders. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, I went to my father's study. It was exactly as he'd left it. The smell of old books and leather, the chessboard on the side table with a game half played, the framed photographs on the wall. Tucked behind a photo of my mother was a smaller, more recent one. It was a picture of me in my dress uniform, taken on the day of a promotion. It was a photo I didn't even know he had. And next to it, in a small, unassuming frame, was a copy of the citation for my Silver Star. He had known all along. He had been displaying it in his own private, understated way in the most personal room in the house. He hadn't needed to tell anyone. He just needed to know. The tears came again, quiet and cleansing. I was not just mourning his loss anymore. I was mourning the lost time, the conversations we could have had if not for the suffocating judgment of others. But I was also filled with a fierce, burning pride. He had seen me. He had understood me. And he had given me the greatest gift a parent can give a child, the freedom to become myself and the unwavering, silent faith that I would prove my worth on my own terms. The next morning, I packed my bag to leave. My life was not here, in these quiet, manicured grounds filled with ghosts and regret. My life was with my unit, my chosen family. As I was walking to my car, Beatrice appeared on the porch. She looked older, smaller, stripped of her usual armor of self-righteousness. "Will you be coming back for the holidays?" she asked, her voice small. The question hung in the air. It was an olive branch, a tentative attempt to stitch back together the fabric she had so carelessly torn. I looked at her, at the magnificent house behind her, at the life I had been so determined to escape, and I felt a sense of closure. "I don't know, Aunt Beatrice," I said, and it was the honest truth. "My duty roster is unpredictable." It wasn't a rejection, nor was it an acceptance. It was a statement of fact. My life was no longer defined by their expectations or their social calendar. My path was my own. I had earned my place in the world, not through birthright, but through courage and sacrifice. And as I drove away, leaving the grand estate and its complicated inhabitants behind, I knew that my father's true legacy was not the name or the wealth he left behind. It was the strength he had instilled in me, the strength to walk away, to stand tall, and to define honor for myself. The silence in the car was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. It was the silence of a soldier who had fought her battle, won her peace, and was finally, truly free.